Good morning. I'm Kevin Mills. I'm President and CEO of the South Carolina Aquarium, and it is my distinct pleasure and honor to be here at this historic and beautiful Penn Center campus. I want to thank Dr. Lawrence and the entire Penn Center team for their hospitality today, beginning with that beautiful breakfast this morning, so thank you all. I also want to thank all of our partners in this dialogue today, and I'm sure for some of you it may come as a bit of a surprise to see the South Carolina Aquarium in the mix of this conversation about climate and about our future. I think most people think about the aquarium largely as it relates to the wonderful family experiences that people can have and the opportunity to see elements and aspects of nature and beautiful creatures that you would otherwise never experience. And while that's certainly true, our mission cuts so much deeper. And we think of ourselves first and foremost as a learning institution, a place for conservation education. We have, since we've opened 16 years ago, educated now more than 1 million students from around the state of South Carolina. We trained 5,000 teachers. We've embarked on a series of conservation initiatives, including our sea turtle rescue program that I know some in the crowd are very familiar with, and our partners too. And this year we've doubled down, and we've decided that we need to do more and to step up because the stakes are so great. We have created a conservation department, and you heard earlier today from our very first ever Director of Conservation, Mr. Albert George. Albert, as you heard, is a product of this community, the Gullah Geechee culture, and his scientific journey has taken him far afield from Atlanta to Maine to the Amazon. We're so fortunate to have him as part of our team. For the aquarium, there is, as Al mentioned this morning, a special poetic resonance to have this first conversation about resilience in this community and in this historic setting. Because as Al mentioned, the aquarium itself sits on Gadsden's Wharf, where 50% of enslaved Americans arrived when they came across that arduous journey. So we feel a particular responsibility to ensure that all the citizens of our state have access to scientific information and to the educational resources that are required to make choices in the face of what's to come and what is happening all around us. And so it is with particular honor that we are here today at the Penn Center. In fact, this year we have commissioned and launched a new initiative that we call the Resilience Initiative for Coastal Education. The acronym is RICE, and that acronym is intentional because it is an homage to the rice communities and to the intentional recruitment of West Africans who understood better than anyone how to harvest rice and to know and recognize and respect that delicate balance between land and sea. And I want to draw your attention at this moment to this beautiful piece of artwork that I'm sure has entranced you from the moment you walked in. This was rendered for this occasion today by an artist who's with us, Sonia Evans, and it is a testament to the rice culture that is prevalent and has been so for hundreds of years in this community. Sonia Evans, would you mind standing? You need to talk to Sonia about her perspective on this work. It's entitled American Gullah, an obvious a tribute and play off of the American Gothic, and it has such a powerful story behind it. So thank you for blessing us with that artwork today. We've had the opportunity to think about this issue of climate change and resilience from a global perspective, and that wonderful film really framed the issues that are affecting us. And what we'd like to do now is to make that global local. We want to bring the conversation home, right here, to this community, to this county, and ask some hard questions about what's happening and what we need to do to get ready for what is certainly going to happen over the next 50 to 100 years. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you a wonderful panel of community experts who each have their own particular perspective on what's happening and what we need to do to be better prepared for what's to come. I'm going to introduce each one by one. They're going to share with you a particular perspective and some framing remarks. And then at the end of that session, we are going to open up to all of you what we hope will be a rich conversation about climate and about what this experience looks like for this community. So I want to begin by introducing our first panelist, Dr. Jeffrey Payne. Jeff is the director for the NOAA Office of Coastal Management, and under his leadership, the nation's coastal management activities are working in unison to address the significant challenges affecting our coastal communities. Dr. Payne has had a long and distinguished career with NOAA, serving previously as director of the Coastal Services Center, acting deputy chief of staff for NOAA, and Deputy Director of NOAA's Office of Policy and Strategic Planning. He has a doctorate in geophysical oceanography from Texas A&M and a bachelor's degree in geology from West Virginia University. He's a widely respected scholar and one of the world's preeminent experts on community resilience and climate adaptation. I can really think of no one better to help us understand this complex issue and to frame what it means to this community than Dr. Jeff Payne. Jeff?
Thank you, Kevin, and good morning, everybody. It is indeed an honor to be here with you today. My wife, Patsy, is in the audience. She's raising her hand, yes. We came here last night, and actually this is both of our first time to be here at the Penn Center. We come down the coast often, but never have actually had the pleasure of stopping and greeting and meeting in this very auspicious place. This is indeed a historic occasion and a historic place, and we're very blessed to be here and honored to be here as well. Thank you as well for the breakfast, those of our folks who have hosted us here today. And I was walking over to the breakfast this morning, and I said, which way should I pronounce the town, St. Helena or St. Helena? And I was advised in both ways. I was advised in one way in particular by several folks, but actually my mother's name was Helen. So I'm going to pronounce it St. Helena. And no disrespect to those who would prefer St. Helena. Good morning to you all. I was really very impressed both by the video and tribute to South Carolina Educational TV, to the Aquarium, to other sponsors, the folks that have put that together, CNN. This kind of thing is really critical because education, the dialogue, the communication is really where we have to start. I think having a global perspective on things is a great way to start, but I think all of us realize that where we affect change and how change occurs is indeed locally. We need to own that. We need to be a part of the solution set, and it's simply not enough to depend on others and to expect that others will ride to the rescue on a white horse, but rather that we actually endorse that self-determination and approach things in that way. So I would very much like to leave that as an initial thought piece for you all. I was also very happy to hear some of the comments on the front end from the folks that helped kick off the meeting, especially the mayor and the work that has been done in Beaufort County and throughout in working with communities to start to address these issues. Also Dr. Rivers, Mrs. Downing, and Dr. Ferguson talked about innovation as a way for us to think. And I think that what was said in the video about orthodoxy, we do need to move beyond orthodoxy. We have to have every bit of respect and appreciation for traditional knowledge and practice and how things are done and how things will continue to be done, because we are all in our own ways very resilient, and we have practiced resilience for centuries, if not thousands of years globally as a species. But we also are in a position where we need to be thinking differently about how we will face these future challenges, many of which were obviously and appropriately highlighted within that video. So I was very happy to see, and I had looked at this before because I knew it was out, the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Report from Beaufort County, South Carolina. This is a very, in my view, progressive document. I think it's an important document. And the reason why I think even the title of this document is significant is because this is not the sea level rise prevention report. It's not the sea level rise capitulation report. It's not the sea level rise denial report. It's the sea level rise adaptation report. And we, again, as a species, humans, existing on this earth for thousands, if not millions of years, have learned how to adapt. And that is a really key word. It's a very key principle in how it is that we will face these oncoming stresses, because they are real, they are here today, they are not going to go away anytime soon. And in fact, many scientists and many folks that are in the management of what we do and how we do it are recognizing that we perhaps have even reached what's called a tipping point, where looking back is going to be tough if we expect to change things based on what we have already done to our environment. So I don't want to really dwell right now on the science, but I do want to talk a little bit about some things that actually provide evidence of the impacts. My former boss, Dr. Holly Bamford, was profiled in that video that you saw. I reported to her for several years. She went downtown NOAA to be the Assistant Secretary for Conservation and Management, one of the 3 top people in NOAA. And you saw her perspective on things. She talked about community. She talked about recognizing that collectively we must work together to address these issues. So we must adapt, and we must take that on as a philosophical and practical principle in how we move forward. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides here because I wanted to kick this off and with my fellow panelists, set some context. And many of you, I hope, have been close to what is occurring. You participated, I hope, in looking at both the impacts as well as perhaps the solutions. And this report actually does highlight a number of the potential solutions that communities like Beaufort and here on St. Helena can take. But we actually need to implement as well, and that's really where the rubber meets the road. So I want to show you a little bit about impacts, a little bit about data, a little bit about how we visualize our vulnerability and our risk, and then a bit about local information and decision making. And I'll go through some slides relatively quickly so that we can get to the other panelists, but just to set this context for this group today, and hopefully the Q&A with the audience on the panel discussion. So this may be a little bit hard to see, but this first slide actually is repeated to some extent within this report. What this shows is the top 10 U.S. areas with increased what we call nuisance flooding. And nuisance flooding is that flooding which occurs above the regular mean high tidal level. And there are reasons why we are seeing a greater frequency today of nuisance flooding, or some people call it recurrent flooding because it does in fact recur. And we are seeing this in many, especially of our East Coast cities, on a national level, more so than in other parts of the country. One of the reasons why, and I'll get to this in the next slide, is obviously sea level rise. And sea level rise is really occurring because of everything you heard in that video about increasing temperature, expansion of seawater, but also ice melt, both the Greenland ice sheet, Antarctica, and other contributions to increasing our sea level. And what has happened is that we have now a new baseline of sea level. And if you look at sea level curves over the last century, and I'll show you data from the tide gauge right here near the Georgia-South Carolina border, is that indeed sea level rise along most of the East Coast has increased over the last 100 years by about 1 foot. So compared to how things were 100 years ago and how things are today, we have a new baseline of sea level. When the mayor stood up here and he talked about water being this level and this level and this level, he's talking about a new baseline of sea level. And when the tides come in, they used to come right to the doorstep or the land surface, and now they come a foot higher than they did before, typically. And then when we have king tides and spring tides, those that bring even more water because of the gravitational influence, the alignment of the planets and the sun, this really then compounds the effect. And we're dealing with this on a regular basis. And why this thing is called nuisance flooding, why we see such an increase, is because of what we have done, if we look at causation. But also because this is an irritant. And when you think about the impacts, you think about how it is that people conduct their daily lives, how they actually get to and from work in their vehicles or by whatever means. If they're going through water on a regular basis on the roads, that's an irritant. And it's also a practical problem that we all address and must address. So we're seeing this as a true impact of what is occurring today. And whether or not you want to argue that it's caused by greenhouse gases and the use of fossil fuels, it is material, in my view, but it may be immaterial in terms of what's actually occurring. So it's facing the facts. So I talked about the tide gauge here at Fort Pulaski in Georgia. The trend is 1.04 feet over the last 100 years, 0.83 feet in 80 years. Then we need to talk as well about projections. What can we expect? Some of you may be familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessments that have gone on through the last couple of decades, and the National Climate Assessment as well, which we are getting ready to conduct yet the next National Climate Assessment. And in those assessments, we are looking not necessarily at global scenarios of sea level rise and change due to a changing climate, a warming climate primarily, but also to local impacts and trying to downscale essentially the climate curves and sea level rise curves that we can expect. And that's where we really need to focus so we can understand and appreciate that sea level rise is relative. It's not happening the same all around the oceans of the planet. It's a relative thing. It's based on what occurs locally in terms of what the land is doing. Is land going up? Is land going down? That has a relative impact on how much sea level rise occurs at that point. It also has to do with ocean circulation patterns, and it has to do with winds. A host of factors actually contribute to this, but we need to be in a place where we can actually work with communities to tell communities what's happening locally. Because if we don't have that information and we can't project that, then we're not going to have the right kind of data and the right kind of information to make wise and practical decisions. So looking at the NOAA intermediate low, just ocean expansion expectations, we might see an additional 0.65 feet by 2050. And then if we add ice melt to sea level, we might see as much as 2.07 feet by 2050 here in this region, right where you live and work and play. So what I'm going to show you is a visualization tool that my office is responsible for. We did create this. We work in partnership in what's called the Digital Coast website. I can give you a reference to that if you would like to learn more after this briefing. But the Digital Coast website is a foundation and a framework for a range of information, from basic data to decision support tools to the kinds of training and engagement that we actually conduct in the responsibilities of my office. This one is what's called a sea level rise visualization tool. And you can see this is right here. The Penn Center is noted on the map. And I'm going to walk you through what it looks like to have sea level rise occur right here from 1 to 6 feet. And the reason why 1 to 6 feet is because the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessments, indicate that by 2100 we may see nationally, globally, as much as 6 feet in sea level rise. So what would that do here locally in terms of what we call inundating, or essentially flooding, the local area? So let's look at 1 foot. There in the southwest corner you see some impacts, low-lying area. 2 feet. The green areas are actually what's called hydraulically unconnected. They are not yet connected with other sources, so they are standalone areas that are prone to flood. And the blue is true connected inundation. That's 3 feet. So now we're starting to see impacts right here, south and southwest of Penn Center. 4 feet. 5 feet. And now you start to see exactly where Penn Center is having impacts as well. And 6 feet. So in Beaufort County, what we can expect with 6 feet of increased sea level and related flooding or inundation on a regular basis is about 22% to nearly 25% of land loss, or land that is compromised and will be wet, making life a bit more miserable and a bit more difficult to maintain in the way that we have. So I want to move on to a couple of the things that we also provide. This is the kind of information resources part of what I wanted to profile, and I can talk more about these things as we get into the Q&A. But basically we provide not only physical and biological information, but we provide socioeconomic information. We work with many, many partners in pulling together the vehicles and the tools that enable us to portray and thus make available that information for communities to understand what's at risk in their area. We call these, in this case, coastal county snapshots. This one is for Beaufort County, and it's what's called the flood exposure snapshot. So what it shows is the percentage of demographically the population that is exposed within the FEMA floodplain, the Federal Emergency Management Agency floodplain. It shows the percentage of people that are elderly and or disabled, and thus at greater risk, more vulnerable populations. It goes down to critical infrastructure in that middle box, and I know you can't see this, but basically shows that amount of infrastructure, the sewer, water, energy, roads that are within the floodplain, and that percentage which is not in the floodplain. And the last one relates to land use, the amount of land that is moving into essentially developed capacity. So when we develop land, we typically do things like put asphalt or macadam down, and that's what's called an impervious surface. So when rainfall comes, when flooding comes, it just sloughs off and it goes somewhere else. And one of the things about Beaufort County is that it has still, along the South Carolina coast, one of the highest percentages of, I wouldn't necessarily say pristine wetlands, but certainly has a high percentage of wetlands. Wetlands are great from the standpoint of resilience because they actually serve to protect, they absorb water, they filter water. There's a whole range of what are called co-benefits, and we can talk more about that. And then this one is related to wetlands, but we also have a section that deals with the ocean and coastal economy. So we provide information on the nature of the economy within coastal counties that is ocean or coastal dependent. So looking at wages and the type of jobs, et cetera. So in this case, we see in the middle box, and I know again that you can't see it, but that has to do with the fishing industry that is located here. The number of jobs, the number of economic potential that that industry actually provides. And you can see 55% in countywide, is indeed wetlands. And the last thing I'm going to show you here is just an example of what we call living with nature. We have a deep appreciation here for the importance of how nature serves us in terms of economic and social benefits, but also protective measures. This is a project that many partners locally, I assume even some of you probably went out and helped to develop these oyster beds in order to help to preserve and protect the shoreline, to encourage sediment growth behind the oyster beds, to expand the marsh. And it may be a little bit hard to see, but on the left-hand side is a typical oyster planting, putting the bags, and then oyster recruitment just a year later in the lower left. You can see the changes. And then the right, I know that's very difficult to see, but those are what are called oyster castles, and it's a different way of actually encouraging oyster growth. And that has occurred a year later to be very successful. So this was working with the Ace Basin Estuarine Research Reserve and other partners locally. About 1,000 people in the area turned out to help with this. And this is the kind of thing that falls into the category of what's called green infrastructure, or natural and nature-based features or solutions, and how it is that we can encourage greater resilience and respect the fact that our natural environment is what we have always depended on, but sometimes we take for granted its importance and what it still can mean to us in the future in terms of addressing these issues, especially related to flooding and impact of storms. And I'm going to stop there. So, Kevin, I'll turn it back over to you, and we'll get the other panelists up.
Dr. Payne, thank you for that assessment and really the eye-opening data, which I know we'll be coming back to. Our next presenter, Kate Parks Schaefer, rejoined the Coastal Conservation League in 2015 as the South Coast Office Director. Previously, she worked in the land use as the Land Use Project Manager and Program Director in the Charleston office from 2009 to 2012. In between, Kate earned her Texas teaching certificate and taught high school biology and environmental science in the Dallas public school system. She earned her Bachelor's of Science in Conservation Biology from Clemson University and an MBA from the Keenan Flagler Business School at UNC Chapel Hill. Kate lives in Beaufort with her husband Paul and enjoys exploring the Lowcountry. And Kate, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I echo the comments of the other panelists and speakers that it's really an honor and a privilege to be here and to work in the Beaufort community. When I moved here a year and a half ago, it was immediately obvious what an amazing jewel we have here on the South Carolina coast, and an incredible community to do advocacy work, because it's filled with people who spend their Saturday mornings learning more about how they can make their home a better place. So thank you for that. I moved here in 2015 and had the opportunity to sit on the Beaufort Port Royal Task Force that Mayor Kaiserling referenced earlier, a citizens group that is designed to look at some critical areas in Beaufort and Port Royal. My colleague Reed, who's in the back there, had the opportunity to work with the county on their sea level rise adaptation plan that was already mentioned this morning. So both of these are important tools when we think about the community-based efforts that can be done to engage on climate change and resiliency issues. And really, what I took away from the video introduction today is something that I always try to think about as an advocate for environmental issues. And that is, how do we build a bigger community of people who care about our environment? Climate change is one of the issues that requires a really big tent and a really big network of supporters, because it impacts not only our natural resources and the species we love, but our food, where we get it, how much it costs, our health, our home, the economy, our culture. So if you don't care about at least one of those things, I guess you find yourself on the outside of the tent, but chances are we care a lot about all, if not more than one. And we have to face and address all of these challenges together. So nothing can be done in isolation, and we can't isolate climate change challenges from the other things we face day to day, because they really are all interconnected. I think you saw with the maps that the threat of sea level rise and climate change here in Beaufort County is real, and I think we can take away a couple of key things from that series of maps and the discussion that we have begun. One is that we have a lot of higher ground that's capable of supporting our community in these changing times. So all is not lost. But we also have some vulnerable areas, and we need to plan accordingly, engaging in 3 primary principles of retreat from the most vulnerable places, mitigation, and adaptation. And when we looked at the Beaufort Port Royal area on the task force, we classified our action into those 3 buckets. The 4th bucket was no action, but I think we can all agree that that's not what we want to pursue. So I want to talk a little bit about individual action and policy change that we can bring about as a community with respect to retreat, mitigation, and adaptation. With the idea of retreat, we need to move away from those most vulnerable areas. So this year we've supported legislation at the State House that sets a permanent baseline on our coastline so that no new construction can be built closer to the ocean than this permanent surveyed line. And this is referred to as a policy of seaward retreat. So no matter how much the ocean and the front beach changes, we will not move closer to the ocean from this surveyed line. And that's a really important policy. It makes common sense, but it needs to be in the books as a policy. And we're close to the state legislature adopting that permanent law, which is very, very important. Another element with retreat involves looking at land planning, and not only where we develop, but where land is protected. And that also looks at marsh migration. So some of our local land trusts, including the Nature Conservancy and others, are really doing some in-depth research right now to look at river corridors and where river corridors might migrate to in the future with respect to marshland. So we want to identify those vulnerable areas, the bright green that came up on the map, so that we know in the future, this is a river buffer right now, but where will our river corridors be in the future, and how will that marsh migrate? And at the local level, this is connected with wetlands and individual development practices. So I think we all as a community have to accept that wetlands fill is not just another step in the approval process, but a really, really serious consideration to how we grow. Because developing in vulnerable areas not only impacts whatever we put there, but with the addition of impervious surface, moves water other places and affects adjacent development as well. With mitigation, our second bucket, mitigation refers to the actions that can reduce the severity of the problem. So if 6 feet is possible, how do we get to a number a little less than 6 feet? What can we do? And one thing that reduces the severity of climate change is a reduction in the use of fossil fuels. So locally, I think that means driving less, boating less in Beaufort County, at least with a motor boat, right? Living and working closer together to reduce our vehicle miles traveled, thinking about how far our food has to travel to get to our plate. That has an energy use component as well. And it means being efficient with our home and our energy use. And in the video, you heard a lot of discussion about water conservation and how conserving water can reduce our demand for fresh water, by 1/3. Energy efficiency is a similar concept. And in South Carolina, it's estimated that energy efficiency with respect to better home insulation, appliance use, regulating our heating and our air better, especially in August and February when we're tempted otherwise. Energy efficiency is really recognized as South Carolina's first fuel, and that can lead to an energy demand reduction by about 20% for our entire state. That's a significant impact when we think about how that is mitigating the impacts of climate change. So to this end, we support local and statewide energy efficiency standards. And South Carolina has some energy home retrofits that are currently in place and available to you as home and business owners. You can have somebody come from the electric cooperatives and the utilities and actually audit your home. And schools are doing this too. It's a great way to get involved and to think about how much energy you use on a daily basis and how you can cut that number. The second component of mitigation is not just a reduction in energy demanded, but a switch in the type of energy we consume. And so we're seeing more renewable energy use in South Carolina too, which is very exciting as our state moves forward in addressing these key issues. Locally, that means that we have better access to home solar panels, if you think about solar panels on your rooftop. In 2014, South Carolina passed what's known as Act 236, which was a completely bipartisan piece of legislation. It passed unanimously, which is also really exciting as well as rare. But it changed the rules for solar energy across South Carolina, and it addressed 3 things. Net metering, solar leasing, the ability to lease solar energy even if you don't have it right on your home, and distributed energy programs. So this means that here in Beaufort County, you can put a solar panel on the roof of your home or your business, and if you generate more energy than you need, you can sell that back to the electric company. So instead of getting a bill every month, you actually get a payment from them. And the electric cooperatives and SCETV and Duke and the power brokers in the state worked on this piece of legislation too, seeing it as a real opportunity to reduce the energy demanded, to switch to the type of energy we consume. And this makes solar much, much more attractive for home and business users. So that's another statewide policy with some really significant individual impact. The final bucket is adaptation, and that refers, I think, to solving problems that are in place, like repairing our existing infrastructure, making sure our bridges and our docks are able to be prepared for rising seas, looking at drainage pipes, stormwater systems, water utilities. And really, I want to highlight the living shoreline component that was mentioned, you saw with the oyster beds, and the green infrastructure piece of adaptation, because there's a lot of things we can do that we learn from nature and the way natural systems adapt to things that we, as the driver of the human system, can employ. So in order to prepare via retreat, mitigation, adaptation, we have to plan comprehensively, and that's why it's so exciting to see so many people here this morning, because when we think about how we grow and how that affects our climate change, or our climate and our local quality of life, we have to look on the larger scale. So Beaufort County's comprehensive plan, I just want to highlight a few things with respect to adaptation and mitigation. It underwent a visioning process and public input, and the first 4 we are actually doing today. So that is identifying or establishing monitoring programs. You saw the maps, we have the data, we have the predictions. Developing and implementing a public education campaign. Welcome, thank you for participating, right? 1 and 2, right there. Wow, you're doing something to address resilience already. Prioritizing, elevating, and protecting low-lying roads, improving coordination among government, maintaining and strengthening retreat policies. These are all things that we're doing today and that we must keep doing in the future to protect our quality of life and all of the things we care about in Beaufort County. So with that, I'll transition to the next panelist, and thank you again for having me this morning.
Kate, thank you for sharing so many sensible and practical applications and solutions. And I love this notion of the big tent. I hope we all leave here today thinking about how we can bring more people under that tent together. Our next speaker is a native of St. Helena Island, Roland Gardner. And he is quoted as saying, "What has been most gratifying and inspiring to me is to live and work in the Beaufort community where I was born and reared." And for more than 35 years, Mr. Gardner has served as Chief Executive Officer of the Beaufort Jasper Hampton Comprehensive Health Services, Inc., which provides quality, accessible health services to more than 19,000 patients in 3 rural counties. Among his many national awards and appointments, Mr. Gardner has served as Board Chair and President of the National Association of Community Health Centers, and also of the South Carolina Primary Health Care Association. In 2011, he was inducted into the Penn Center 1862 Circle for his outstanding contributions to the preservation and rich history of the Gullah Geechee culture and for his efforts to protect and preserve this culture as a national resource. Also in 2011, he was appointed by U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, to a 4-year term on the National Advisory Committee on Rural Health and Human Services to provide policy recommendations to the U.S. government. Mr. Gardner graduated from St. Helena High School, received an undergrad degree at A&T State University in Greensboro, North Carolina. He earned a master's degree from Howard University and furthered his education at UNC Chapel Hill, so alumni, the University of Alabama, as well as Harvard University. So Mr. Gardner, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's always great being home. It's great to see Saber Slaughter again. When I started my career after grad school, the first person I met when I came back to Beaufort was Saber. And we've been talking MUSC and community health center business for the last 35, 40 years. Dr. Rivers, that I met a couple years ago, has always been a friend, and Dr. Avram also. I'm going to use a different perspective this morning from the standpoint of just talking about the Community Health Center. As we mentioned, we are serving about 19,000 patients in the 4 counties. We do approximately 100,000 visits a year. But a part of that, I think, comes from the collaboration that we get not only from the county council, the 2 council members here, we get a lot of support from the county council, but we also get a federal grant from U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Beaufort Jasper is one of the oldest community health centers in South Carolina, I think second only to the one in Orangeburg and the one in Charleston. Right now we have staff of about 200 employees. Primary care services, we have 14 physicians on staff. We offer lab, pharmacy, x-ray, all in a one-stop center. I'm going to talk about a number of things about national global warming, but what happens here in rural South Carolina, what happens in a rural community like Beaufort, Jasper, and Hampton counties. We are really dependent on a lot of our natural resources that are affected by climate change. And as a result of that, we must face the kind of dilemma that we talked about that we saw in the film earlier this morning. The limited impacts, or the related impacts currently in rural communities, it deals with farming, water supply, transportation, emergency health care. Rural communities face particular geographic, demographic obstacles from time to time because of bridges and roads. I think it's once said that Beaufort County has 166 islands, and of those 166, about 77 are actually inhabited. But look at bridges and causeways and what we have throughout the community. It makes a very hard challenge, I guess, to get support to a lot of these communities. Think about St. Helena Island prior to 1928, 29. There was not a bridge to the city of Beaufort. The first bridge was built in 1926. And there was major opposition again from the Penn folk at that time saying that that was going to destroy St. Helena Island. So that was a challenge back then. Then second, we got the Mateo Bridge in 1982, but I think about Christmas Eve of 1986 when the Beaufort Bridge was locked on Christmas Eve. You talk about the panic in the community because of the restriction of getting off of one island into the other area. Rural communities, we have to adapt. That's one of the things that I've seen over the years. When you talk about St. Helena Island in 1959, when we were underwater, Hurricane Gracie, That was a major, major challenge for us. We could not get on or off the island. Recently, you think about the erosion at Hunting Island, and you think about the global warming change that we've had over the years. But you think about also a community like St. Helena, where you have an agriculture community because of the planning and also the natural resource that we have with the oceans, with fishing and crabbing. Those things are major impact for us because at the standpoint, when you look at what happens if there is a major problem with the drought, then this community, because we serve the migrant seasonal farm workers here in Beaufort County. When I was growing up, there were more than 24,000 acres of land farmed by tomatoes and cucumbers. Now they're less than 5,000. You look at what we have now with migrant seasonal farm workers who serve this community. We have a special migrant clinic that we operate throughout the years. We start the clinic, we're running it next week, where we start at 7 o'clock in the evening and we serve the last migrant and seasonal farm workers at 2 o'clock in the morning. But they come in, they harvest those crops, and they come in and also supply us food for the Southeast. You look at the challenge that we have as far as health care. The seasons when we have a lot of infectious diseases, we think about the summers when there are problems with heat strokes. We know at the Community Health Center that certain parts of the year that we have to staff up at the health center for those seasons. I think about the elderly senior citizens when we normally have about 15 or 16 people in the hospital during a certain part of the season, but when flu season starts, we have 35 or 36. So we have to staff up for that from time to time because we know that there will be problems with diseases, with infections. We think about those times in the school year with kids going back to school, we have to staff up for immunizations for them also. But you talk about that, you talk about global warming, you talk about the effects of global warming. We have to address those things. We have to be flexible enough. And I think you look at over the years, community health centers have been very flexible. We swing with the tide, whatever is needed from the standpoint of providing services in a community where you cannot think of everything that's going to happen in the community. You have to be prepared. That has been one of the missions I think we've done over the years. The things that I want to address is when you look at more than 95% of the land in the United States being rural, less than 90% of the population lives in those communities. From a health standpoint, climate change has impacted, I said infectious diseases, but at the same time, you talk about the heat strokes and the other problems that we have also. Higher temperatures also rise and the levels of ozone and other pollutants in the air, and it also challenges us for cardiovascular activity. So I'm going to sit down right now and talk about, waiting for the questions from you all to see exactly what we can talk about, because I think we have to adjust to whatever is needed, what is desired in the community for climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner, for bringing home those very real human impacts that are part of this conversation today. Our next speaker, Reverend Dr. Nanette Pearson, is founder and director of the Sandalwood Community Food Pantry, operating from the present Queen Chapel AME on Hilton Head Island. And in Dr. Pearson's words, if I may, in August of 2008, I moved to Hilton Head Island from New Jersey, to a place where the poorest of the poor are hidden behind lush golf courses and luxury ocean villas and homes. To break a cycle of hunger, I made a commitment to provide a centralized system for collecting and distributing food, reducing waste, and alleviating hunger. On February 17, 2009, at Sandalwood Terrace Apartments, I opened the pantry door to welcome our first 5 families. 7 years later, that number has risen to more than 700 families served. And while that number is certainly disheartening, being able to feed them allows for hope to replace hunger. Sadly, the lines continue to grow as my clients, who often lead a life not of their own choosing, continue to walk through our doors. They grace me with their friendship, gratitude, and powerful witnessing, always reminding us that people need to be restored. Reverend Dr. Pearson, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I moved just in time because I get very, very chilly. The last time I was here a few months ago, I was invited to be a part of a workshop called Beloved Conversation. It was on race relation. I was the only person amongst a group of many with no one of color. So I asked my dear friend Albert George. I begged him, dragged him here. I think he was happy. And he came, and I stand here today, now I know why. I feel as if I was meant to bring him here. This is holy, sacred ground, and it's very dear to me and to the many people that I feed at my food pantry. So you might wonder, how was someone who runs a food pantry have anything to do with climate change? This is something very interesting I read. It was a little story this morning. I always ask myself, is it true? Can it be true? So I'm never sure if anything's really true. But about 175 years ago, a mayor of Charleston, and that would be Jacob Mincing. He was the 33rd, my favorite number, mayor. And he offered a $100 gold medal to anyone who could come up with a solution to the coastal flooding in the city streets. That award has never been granted. Having said that, I know it will be soon. I'm very optimistic. But to go back to my pantry and the 700 and growing families I feed, many with Gullah Geechee roots, many names that I see at Honeyhorn. They come to me week after week after week, and they have to make decisions no longer if they'll have food on their table, but if they have to pay their electric bill or they'll have money for their prescriptions. So you might say, well, what does that have to do with climate change again? Many of my people really don't trust the fact that officials, community will come in and take care of them in a catastrophic crisis. I want to be sure, best I can, and I'm only one person, that my people that I serve will be saved by choice and not chance. And I know we can accomplish that. I know if I have the proper information and I can disseminate that information to my people, many who don't have cell phones certainly don't have computers. Every homeless person that I've gotten jobs for this year, I've gone to the library with, and I have to say I was intellectually challenged filling out the BILO application form. And yes, he did get the job, Dan. But, you know, my people need to be assured, and they really can't trust because so much has been taken from them, so much. You know, we want to give new roads, good, strong roads, but do we ask, is it harder to walk on those asphalt roads home because most of my people walk to my pantry or bicycle? Or was the dirt road a little bit cooler? We need to communicate, we need to know, and I always say, for me, I go to the people. I live among them. I learn from them and I love them. But I start with what they know and I build on what they have. Because I believe that any great leader, when their task is done, their goal accomplished, they will hear all the people say, "Whew, look what I have done." Right? So what we need to do, as far as I'm concerned with this climate change and the rising, it's going to happen, and there's 3 solutions that I see. I was going to sing Sam Cooke for you all, but I always say I have the worst voice in the world. But as a minister, I used to say, well, God gave me this voice, I'm giving it right back. So here goes. I don't know much about history, don't know much about biology, don't know much about science books, oh, don't know much about the French I took, but I do know that I love you, and I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this could be. See, we could have a wonderful world if we're willing to get out of the box if we're willing to get dirty with dignity, if we're willing to say it's okay if you look like that, or you don't have teeth in your mouth, or you smell a little different than me because I wear tova, but I'm your sister, and we're going to get through this together. And if that water climbs up, I promise you I will get to that trailer, and I will figure out a way to do it. My dream, I'll share with you. I want to have the first resilient food pantry on Hilton Head Island. I want a pantry where all my people who know how to get there with, oh, I feed all their pets too. I started that 3 years ago, yeah, because they were feeding their pets their food, and I didn't want to do that. So now I have a wonderful, generous person who gives me enough funds for dog food and cat food. I want to be able to have them come to a safe place where they can be secure, because they may not be going off the island. I know they didn't with Hugo. I know they didn't with Andrew. I know I was in those trailers, and they were shaky and wobbly. And you know, some of them don't have electric, and some of them don't have water, and some of them don't have anything. So I think that together, if we're not afraid to talk about what the underlying issues are, where the mistrust comes from, where the fear comes from, you know, I love them, they love me, we trust, we can do things. When I was a little girl, my mama, she shared something with me. It was Edward Everett Hale's words. John F. Kennedy used them too, and I never forgot them. He said, I am only one, but I am one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And what I can do, that I ought to do. And what I ought to do, by the grace of God, I shall do. I'm going to say amen to that and sit back down.
Reverend Dr. Pearson, thank you for sharing your vision and reminding us what a challenge this is for folks who don't have the resources that so many of us take for granted. Thank you for speaking to that. Our final speaker offers yet another unique perspective on this issue, and critically important. Lieutenant Colonel Neil Baxley is commander of the Emergency Management Division for Beaufort County since 1913. And he's had a long and distinguished career in emergency management and law enforcement for the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office, which he joined in 1983. He served as a patrol deputy, a patrol supervisor, a training sergeant, deputy commander, and deputy chief of staff. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps in 1979 and completed his basic training at Parris Island. And he was assigned to the Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort in 1980 and achieved the rank of sergeant before his enlistment ended in 1983. We're so pleased to have his perspective on emergency management and how it relates to climate change. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Baxley.
First off, I'm not going to sing. I can't follow that act. Kevin said that I joined the Marine Corps in 1979, and I arrived at Parris Island in late August of 1979, about 4 days in advance of Hurricane David. And that's a different story that I tell in my hurricane presentations. It's quite entertaining. But it gave me my first introduction to hurricanes in the Low Country. Went to Memphis, got my aviation electrician training, and came back to Beaufort in 1980 and fell in love with Beaufort County. My family roots trace in South Carolina to 1745, but I was born in the Tar Heel State and went to high school and graduated there and then joined the Marine Corps. When I joined the Sheriff's Office, Roland's brother-in-law, and I didn't know this until this morning that they were actually family, was my training officer. And the very first night that I was in a patrol car with the Sheriff's Office in 1983 in July, he brought me to Penn Center and told me what it was. I didn't know what it was, but I was a student of American history, and I loved reading about it. From that night on, I made sure that Penn Center was an important place in my patrol routes, that I made sure that I checked the buildings and did what I could to protect this location. And as I've become higher up in the Sheriff's Office, I've made sure that it was involved in any type of training exercises that we did, that we didn't forget about Penn Center. 2008, we did Vigilant Guard, which was we had 35 states, National Guard units represented here in Beaufort County, a huge exercise, took 2 weeks, and Penn Center was one of our training sites to make sure that it was incorporated. So I have a real appreciation. I'm humbled to be here today talking about emergency management and talking to y'all, and I appreciate y'all coming out, as some of the others said, on Saturday morning. That's promising to be a very beautiful Saturday. We've talked about already the infrastructure, and you've heard that mentioned by almost every speaker, the infrastructure. As emergency management director, that concerns me greatly. While it's important that I look 10, 15, 20 years down the road, I have to look to tomorrow. I have to be prepared and have the county prepared and the emergency services of Beaufort County prepared for a disaster that could happen tomorrow. And infrastructure worries me greatly. We have a number of roadways that are barely above sea level on any given day. When we suffer some of the nuisance flooding that we do suffer regularly, I have to send emergency vehicles, fire trucks, and ambulances and patrol cars through those flooded areas to deal with the day-to-day calls for service. Well, we drive our cars through them and we don't think about it. But those flooded areas and that nuisance flooding are salt water. And that's impacting the lifespan of those vehicles. So an ambulance that we would expect to last us 6 years might only last 5 because of its being run through that salt water regularly. We have houses in the county now that, due to changing coastline, erosion, sea level rise, we cannot service any longer. We have several houses on Defusky Island we can't get to any longer, and they've had to be condemned by county building codes because we cannot service them. We cannot get fire trucks or ambulances to those houses. We have houses in a number of other parts of the county. We have dirt roads in the county that, during the nuisance flooding, during the excessive rains, we cannot get to the citizens on the other end of those roads because they lie just above sea level. So the infrastructure worries me greatly. Last October, South Carolina experienced a tremendous flood through the middle part of the state, Lexington, Richland, down through Williamsburg and Clarendon and Georgetown, or Charleston and Dorchester counties. Beaufort County was spared. We went and helped our neighbors in Georgetown and in Clarendon counties. But what we saw was that the aging infrastructure, we had dozens and dozens of bridges and hundreds of roadways washed out. Today, there are still 29 bridges that haven't even begun to be repaired as a result of that flood. Now, Beaufort County didn't experience it, but we do face the same aging infrastructure. And that worries me because it costs a lot to do it. One of the speakers on the video said $1 trillion just to catch up. And that's an expense that we're going to have to bear, but we have to do it to prepare. We live in an in-time delivery economy. We talked about the agriculture and getting the food to our grocery stores to reach our tables. These roadways that lie just above sea level, if I lose those roadways due to nuisance flooding or erosion, or in the case of a tropical storm, serious water inundation, I cannot get any of the essential services that we need in Beaufort County to where they need to be. This all concerns me because we have got to take the time, we've got to make the effort to focus on how it's affecting the infrastructure, not only 15, 20 years down the road, but today. And that's going to be my point today, is just focus on that now. Everybody transition to the right. Who do I transition to? I transition back to you.
Thank you, Neil. So I'm going to do my best now to channel my own inner John King and moderate this panel. And what we'd really like to do is to hear from you and the questions that are on your minds, the things that you've been thinking about in advance of today, and perhaps even this morning as you've heard this commentary. We put a few questions up there just to sort of prompt your thinking. You know, what have you noticed in the region over the last few decades in the way of physical changes? Have you experienced beach erosion and flooding? What worries you the most? What are you concerned about? And what tools, most importantly, would help you to better contend with this changing environment? So these are just some questions and food for thought. We have a microphone that we're happy to circulate when you have questions. If anyone has one right off the bat, we'll pass that around. Otherwise, I'll jump into a first question and we'll get things rolling. Any questions right off the gut? Sure, right over here.
Thank you very much. My name is George Johnston, and regarding that first question, it's a physical change that each and every person in this room can see as they drive down Route 21. Just look to your right, and you'll see acres and acres of fill for our new Walmart being put in. And this amounts to 22,000 truckloads of fill. And where does that all fill come from? It comes from our esteemed Gullah Geechee corridor. It comes from St. Helena Island. There is a mining permit in place where that fill, this sacred ground, is taken to supplement and raise that ground. And that ground, next to the airport, was identified by the Mayor Keisling's Sea Level Rise Task Force as one of the 5 low spots in Beaufort and Port Royal. So on those very ground that the task force identified as a low spot, 22,000 tons of dirt are being transplanted to create this parking lot and impervious surface, which is going to affect sea life, traffic, a Walmart 20 minutes away. And basically, we have related all this to our esteemed Walmart ethics group. They have an ethics group with which we've corresponded with, and we even forwarded a film by our late Reverend Clemente Pinckney, where he showed Gullah culture, and we also pointed out that this Walmart is not in concert or compatible with the Gullah Geechee corridor, to which it is nearby. So, a great failure. I don't know what we do about it. We have some politicians here, perhaps, who can talk about this permit. We have a judiciary, we have judges who overruled the city when they put up an objection to this development. But the judiciary, I don't know if there's any members of the judiciary here today, but there's a lot of people with a lot of influence. And the result, please note, as you drive back home over this Route 21, what the result is.
Thank you for sharing. Any comments or response from the panel?
I think it's your answer.
Thank you, and I think raising land use concerns, whether it's about the Walmart particular or just how we develop and grow in the future, definitely relates to how resilient we are as a community, and I think it comes back to some main principles, and that is that we have to plan comprehensively together from the beginning. That's where this county task force recommendation is so important, not just to sit on a shelf, but to be in your brain every time you speak to an elected official or think about growth in the community. One of the recommendations I highlighted listening to George speak, limiting development in high-risk areas. We need to plan and we need to advocate to limit development in high-risk areas. And that means not only creating a plan, but making sure that it is followed and its recommendations are followed at every step of the permitting and growth and development process. So there's planning, there's public advocacy, there's litigation as a tool, of course, and then learning from mistakes. So if there are mistakes that have been made, we cannot repeat them. Similarly, if other communities have made some mistakes, we can learn from them as well, and we can leapfrog some of those challenges. And I think that's an opportunity we have as a community in Beaufort County to think about the challenges of perhaps our larger or more populated neighbors, how they have addressed or failed to address those challenges, and how we can learn from those to be better.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Anybody?
Yeah, well, I would just add as well that I have this abiding fascination with the role that all stakeholders play, including, broadly speaking, the business community. And when I think about resilience, I think about the interconnection of the economy and our social structures and obviously our environment and the feedback loops that are so inherent to its basic functionality. We really can't have one without the other, and they all need to mutually reinforce, and they need to be reinforced in a balanced way. So I do think that what Kate just shared about comprehensive land use planning, for example, comprehensive business planning, all of those things are really critical to this. But I do feel as well that, you know, the business community, I find more and more these days, and I hesitate to use the word altruism, but I do find that the business community as a global partner is becoming more tuned to its role and its necessity to act in fundamentally responsible ways. It's not always and forevermore going to be about the bottom line, because if it is, I feel that we will eventually find ourselves in even more dire straits than we are today. So there are really, I think, shining lights out there amongst the, broadly speaking, business community that are helping to lead the way. And we need to embrace and work with all of these stakeholders so that we are making decisions that are sensible and practical and do the least harm as well.
Great. Thank you. Other questions?
I'm Victoria Smalls, a resident here of St. Helena Island, and I'd like to speak to, have you seen an increase in beach erosion and flooding? And growing up here on the island, our favorite place to go is Hunting Island State Park. And as a youngster, maybe my earliest memories are about 4 or 5 being on the beach with my family. And my sister here, Lynn, can attest to us going to the beach and having much beach to enjoy, and not seeing the graveyard of beautiful trees that are lying on the beach. And so the beach that I learned to swim on and swim within the ocean is much farther out than I recall as a youngster. And so I talked to my daughter about that, who's about 11 years old, and we went to the beach last summer, and much to our surprise, we were swimming with an alligator. And we decided to leave immediately. And we just saw it in the break of a wave we thought it was a log, one of the trees that were going out towards the ocean. We looked closely, like, no, that's an alligator. So she decided to do her science fair project about why am I swimming with alligators? She called it "See You Later, Alligator." And she won, but it was her way of informing her school and her community about flooding in our area and what it's causing to our life here, the animal life here in our area, and how it's interfering with the salinity of the waters and confusing everyone, including us, when we go swimming and seeing alligators in the water. That was just my comment on how definitely, I know everyone in here sees it at Hunting Island, and then it is just so evident when you go out there and the trees are disappearing, the cabins are disappearing. I think there's one lonely skeleton of a cabin that is pretty much gone. But that's what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, and congratulations to your daughter. This is obviously a challenging issue for everyone that lives along the coastline, and the issue of beaches, which are so critical for nesting habitat for the species we care about, as well as places that people live. What do we need to think about when we think about programs like beach re-nourishment as we look to the future and the changing coastline?
I think one thing we need to talk to the state legislature and the people who actually make decisions about funding beach nourishment projects. You know, Hunting Island is the second busiest state park in South Carolina. I think Myrtle Beach being first, or Hunting Island being second. But I think to educate our members of the state legislature, local and statewide, to have them have input into it, because I think, as Victoria said, I remember also the beach being much further out and more palmetto trees, but we need to make sure that we elect officials who actually have a vested interest in the natural resources that we have in the area so they can continue supporting those things.
Kevin, I want to extend that thought a minute. In 1983, when I went with the sheriff's office, there were, I think, about 32 or 33 cabins on Hunting Island, and they were connected by a paved road. Most of that road is now gone. There's the one skeletal structure that sits about 50 yards offshore now, and there are 2 cabins that are still there. As we began to lose the cabins, we had to adjust our emergency response to the point where we had to the Park Service had to erect a footbridge across the lagoon. and our emergency vehicles would respond to the Hunting Island Pier parking lot and then traverse on foot across that footbridge to provide services. And it finally got to a point where, as county government, we had to notify the folks down there, we could no longer do that. We couldn't guarantee you a response. And we had to do it through the form of a resolution through county council. And while, you know, we're adjusting, that's also affecting our economy. Because as Roland said, that's the shining jewel in the state park system, which brings folks to Beaufort County. And we're experiencing that on several of our, all of our barrier islands. We're experiencing the erosion. It's affecting the houses. It's affecting our responses, I've stated a couple of times, and it's affecting our economy. If you can't rent a beach house, which is how you want to spend your vacation, you'll go somewhere else. So the beach nourishment, I'm not going to get into the science of it, but I know it's been fairly well proven that it can be done properly, and so as to protect all of the beach and not just change the flow of the tide. I think, as Roland said, we need to address our legislatures that funding the beach renourishment is an important part of addressing the resiliency of our economy in Beaufort County.
Thank you.
I noticed all the construction, and of course, it was at this place with Penn Institute that we talked about not widening the road, Highway 21. Because when any type of widening comes, there are people who are stockholders who will come to that area and develop. So we fought the widening. We fought Family Dollar coming, because as one comes, so comes their friend. Family Dollar got in, and we knew right away somebody else was going to come. And all citizens don't realize that when you bring in the big box stores, that other people are going to come. That's not an issue with me. My main issue is people my age and the change in climate control and our health issues. The more trees you cut, the less clear air you have. The more you do other things, you can't walk around places because things have happened. So my issue is for quality of life. I want it to be so that I can inhale and exhale, and that when I inhale and exhale, I'm inhaling good, clean air. There are more cancer issues now. There are more issues of lungs, and that's because we can't inhale and exhale. Food is processed so fast. I don't know where they raise all these chickens to have all these kind of things done. We can't get the food from the sea. We can't get all the oysters and the crabs and the shrimp that I learned to enjoy. So my issue is that we need to have a flow and maintain a balance, that when people my age are here, we want to be able to enjoy recreation, yes, clean air, yes, and good food.
So it's Ravinia, is that right? Is your name Ravinia? I'm sorry, we met at this point.
Since Ravina, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Since she mentioned her age, she taught me in high school. Let me say that, you know, Ravina, she and I have learned to agree to disagree, and we talked about the highway situation. Again, I have been a landowner in St. Helena for a number of years, and you and I talked about the highway and expansion. My concern was the emergency vehicles getting on and off the island. I mean, you win some, you lose some. You talk about the property that you have, and family members, a number of people have had property for generations. I still think about the kids and their families who still own property, not for major development, but they still have to drive to Hilton Head or go someplace else to find jobs. So, you know, you taught me enough to be a thinker years ago, but, you know, I learned to disagree with you, and I think you and I are still friends. But again, the safety that they have to run through with a couple accidents, and I think about the Heritage Days parades. I mean, we have gridlock here. I mean, I know Neil and them have to do something else about the traffic pattern for that day because of emergency, because every time we have Heritage, there's an accident. It takes an hour and a half to get off the island. So again, you have to have the controlled development, but at the same time, look at success that you're going to have in the future also. And I know all you are too, Ravina, so I won't say anything.
I did teach him, and I taught him to respect people. there has to be a balance. You know, you can't, people come here because, of course, the way you can live here. But as they come, things are destroyed. So you got to have a balance, and that's what I'm saying now. It has to be a balance.
I agree.
And that's what we need to do.
Thank you. And to her point, South Carolina's never been more popular. We see this region, Charleston, Myrtle Beach, three of the top growing markets in the country, really. Hundreds of thousands of new restaurants, tens of millions of tourists every year. So how do we begin to achieve that balance in our planning? What steps do we need to take?
Well, I think in terms of community involvement in local planning, we all play a role, and we have to be involved in the process. And the only way to influence positive change and to create a future that we would like to see for our community is to engage. So the Penn School really has been a leader with the preservation school centered around the widening of Highway 21 and how we can maintain the quality of life and the integrity of a community with the threat of land conversion. And what does land conversion look like? If done poorly, what does that mean in terms of our gains and our losses? If done well, what does that mean? And being able to envision a future that's different than the status quo is a real challenge, but a great opportunity. And so comprehensive planning efforts, the counties and the cities engage in them, but local communities have to be involved. I'm just a big believer that you force a seat at the table. And when you do that, we're going to come up with more creative ways to solve these challenges. Like I said, climate change is not an isolated challenge, so every decision we make has impacts, and that means we need to think about it in every decision we make. So,
Thanks, Kate.
I also think that key is preparation. As a child, I was always taught preparation is the key to success. And I just came back from India, and I was up in the Himalayas, and I can see what a lot of backpacking, tourism came in, and when you're not prepared, what do you do with all the plastic bottles? What do you do with all the trash? What do you do with it all? Then you can look at a country like Bhutan. The king there says, if you're coming to visit my country, you'll respect my culture. You'll honor my people. You will not get to do what you think is best for you, but what is best for all. This is very important. If we can begin to prepare better, we won't be at risk with billions and trillions of dollars of damage if we could only look ahead and say, what would be the best way? How could we save millions of dollars by enacting this one small measure instead of waiting for a catastrophic crisis to hit and then still have to figure out where are we? Still, 10 years later, Katrina, still. So I think that preparation is key, and we're not investing enough of our time and talents and skills in preparedness. We wait for something to just rupture, and we can't keep putting Band-Aids on. It's just not going to work anymore.
Great, thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, I would love to endorse, I will in fact endorse what Reverend Dr. Pearson just said. Holly Bamford in the video made the statement that we spend approximately 15 times as much on the response and the recovery as we do on the preparedness. And there are statistics that suggest that every dollar that we put into mitigation on the front end really pays back $4 in terms of costs avoided in the long run. Getting to that issue of where you site facilities, looking at future risk, and we're talking today about future risk, whether or not we have a high degree or a low degree of uncertainty, it is coming. And so if we continue to develop, and Kate I think had really good points about this, in the same way we always have, again, the orthodoxy, we're going to pay the costs. And if you think about how it is that we respond to these mega events, it's not just Sandy, it's not just Katrina, it's not just Irene, not just hurricanes, it's drought, it's a whole range of things that actually cost a lot of money. And part of the problem is that we are more vulnerable. We have more people moving to the coast on a daily, weekly, yearly basis. We are at greater risk because the stresses are still the same. And now we have new ones which are more insidious, like sea level rise and like ocean acidification, affecting the very basic food web in our oceans. we need to think differently, again, think outside the box, to be innovative about how we move in different ways. And if we're going to continue to cite structures that are economically beneficial, perhaps in the short term or for expediency, in places where people really want to be, like having that cocktail on the deck of that restaurant with the water lapping very nearly at your feet, which everybody really kind of does like, we're still going to pay the costs of when either the hurricane strikes or the sea level rises. And when I say we're going to pay the costs, all of us are paying the costs. It's not just whether or not that property or that facility or that infrastructure was insured in whatever way, but fundamentally and ultimately, it all comes back. Because when we plan, there's a philosophy of least cost planning, which says it has to actually incorporate all of what are called externalities, the costs of doing what you do. So if we are expecting to get electricity out of coal, then there are derivative impacts and costs related to the burning of that coal for producing electricity. But we don't really factor those in. That's really not the way we have evolved to date, and that dynamic has to change.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes.
Thank you all. I'm so proud of our mayor and all of the mayors on the coast that have denied offshore drilling. And thankfully, we'll keep that going wherever the mayor is. My question is, now that we've said, no, you can't drill on our shores, why do we have to keep fighting the seismic testing that they're trying to encroach on us still? I mean, we've said no. Why do they keep trying, and why can't we stop them?
Anyone want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, sure, I'll try to answer that. We actually, my program is responsible for the state-federal partnership in coastal zone management, so the coastal zone management programs under the Department of Health and Environmental Control in the state. And a part of how that works is that the states, through the CZM programs, have what's called a federal consistency provision. So if agencies or external partners are going to be doing things which can potentially compromise the integrity of the approved state coastal zone management plan, then the state has a stick to use to try to stop that. As it went through that process, it was determined that there would not actually be significant impacts on resources or otherwise of the seismic testing, and so the consistency determination did not stop at that time the testing. Now, I may have some good points to make about whether or not there would be impacts, but there is a certain standard that needs to be set and met. And so with President Obama's action a month or two ago, where he basically said, no, we're not going to do this, the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, BOEM, I believe, is now no longer moving forward, but I may be wrong in terms of what continuous pressure is coming your way. So I'm probably not as up to speed with what you're referencing and the continued pressure, but I know that the president did in fact take this off the table in his announcement, despite the fact that he said a couple of years ago we're going to do it.
And with respect to that, the Coastal Conservation League, the City of Beaufort, and others, both organizations and municipalities, challenged the permit that was issued, arguing that seismic testing does have an immense impact on marine life. And there is a petition online if you would like to sign it, or if you haven't already, because that is still another opportunity for public advocacy to affect a positive outcome. Just as coastal mayors and coastal communities recognize that offshore drilling would be detrimental to the local tourism and fisheries economy, seismic testing is a dangerous way to receive information about the availability of what's offshore. So there's a way to affect change at that level as well. And then I think beyond that, we have to make the transition to what's next and how we use energy more efficiently, how we can rely to a greater extent on renewable energy, and what those opportunities look like in South Carolina. And I think there are some positive actions taking place at the state and local level to help us transition and make that bridge. And the sooner we can encourage and elect our elected officials to get on board, the better, from an environmental and an economic perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with everybody's
interest and everybody's concerns. In terms of beach erosion, we came here 6 years ago for the beach, for Hunting Island Beach, and it was wonderful. And every year, a whole row of palm trees were gone, every year, every year. What role do you think, and what maybe is being done to recognize, accept, acknowledge, and educate that Hunting Island is a barrier island? It is going to change and move.
Yeah, I'll start. I think everybody may have an opinion, either experiential or on a science basis, but yes, indeed, you are absolutely correct. Barrier islands are meant to both accrete, they build, and they erode. They go away. And it's a constant thing. It's a natural thing. We have, in fact, as a species, engineered very nearly the entire planet in one way or another, and we continue to do so. And I don't necessarily, as a professional or in a personal way, argue against beach nourishment. I think that it has and does have its role. It certainly is a contributing factor to sustaining economies in certain ways, as well as the way in which we live in these areas. However, at the same time, we are now facing, again, this insidious threat of a rising sea level, and with a rising sea level, we're going to have continuous wave action. If, in fact, we have more frequent and intense coastal storms as a change or a modification to the environment as the temperature goes up, we may, in fact, be seeing much more energy put into our coastal areas. And so that's going to exacerbate erosion. It's a big problem. It's a big deal. And I think that, and I don't want to endorse or say that we need to retreat. We need to run away from it all. But we have to think in terms of the risk and the long-term evaluation of that risk, the costs and benefits of, do we continue to live and play in these places, or do we think about it in different ways?
Sally?
Kate mentioned marsh migration, and barrier islands will migrate. We'll always have a shoreline, which may not be where we want it, but we'll always have a shoreline. I'm concerned about the seawalls that will be placed up in the marsh to protect property. Because if the marsh can't migrate, then it will drown, and the bumper stickers are right. No salt marsh, no seafood, which has ecological implications as well as economic ones.
Thanks, Sally. And I think one of the ways we can think about how to allow the marsh to move naturally, how these natural processes of erosion and accretion and change in our most vulnerable areas to occur, is to look at the natural processes. What is nature doing? How does it respond to its own movement and challenges? So looking at things like green infrastructure and living shorelines and limiting our hardened impact. The more hard surfaces we place upon the environment, the harder actually it is for the environment to respond, and it will shift water movement and patterns. So filling wetlands, hardening marshes with seawalls, those types of physical barriers are engineering solutions, yes, but they interfere with the natural system, and they don't allow for that change to occur more naturally and more gracefully. We're forcing an outcome rather than allowing the change over time and responding to it.
Thanks, Kate. Gentleman right here.
I'm Stanford Hines. I'm here from Savannah, Georgia. And I would like to say that I'm pleased to see that your community and your community leaders are well in advance of a lot of our folks back in the good old state of Georgia. Although I also want to say that we have a joint interest in forwarding and protecting our coastal bounty. And that's one of the reasons I'm here. I'm here to learn, and I'm here to indicate that we have some people who are willing to join you in getting the word out that this is an important thing, and that it's important that our local leaders not persist in a state of denial in terms of non-action in a situation where we have to act and acknowledge that there are things that we have to do. So I commend you on your local leadership and the people that you have that are supporting you. And I hope you can get the word out to other people that this is something that needs to proliferate and spread as opposed to staying in a local area. So shine your light.
Thank you for joining us, and what a wonderful statement. Okay, yes, sir, we'll have one more.
I hear all this talk about in regards to preparedness and emergency management people, and I'm just wondering at what point do you say to people that you don't let them develop instead of waiting until they've already developed and they've placed there, and you say you can't get to them anymore? At what point do city governments say, banks, you cannot issue a 30-year mortgage to people who are buying homes here anymore, because if you look at the reality of what's going to happen, in 30 years we will not be able to get to you for services. At what point do banks say, or cities or counties say, we can't do this anymore? I mean, yeah, that's my question. I have a friend who's a climate scientist. She was just down in Florida. Mayor of Coral Gables is already looking into the legal ramifications of what the city has to provide when banks are issuing 30-year mortgages when they don't think they're going to be there in 30 years. I'm just curious.
I hate to throw two guys under the bus, but you have two members from Beaufort County Council back there.
That's exactly where I was going.
Bill McBride and Mr. Dawson.
It's an excellent question. I think it's one that would be well answered over lunch. I want to thank, first of all, our panelists this morning for their generous time.